When you're working with a pivot table, you might want to have a good visual representation of that table by way of a pivot chart. It's very similar to a standard chart in Excel, but it is in sync constantly with your pivot table. And as you make changes to pivot table layouts, the pivot chart will respond immediately. You can create a pivot chart all by itself, but I think it's going to be better to have it with a pivot table. And oddly enough, when you create a chart by itself, it automatically creates a pivot table. In this particular worksheet here, we want to create a pivot table. There's no empty rows in this data. There are no empty columns. We'll go to the Insert tab and choose Pivot Chart, the drop arrow below it. We can create a pivot chart and pivot table. Let's just create pivot chart here. Excel figures out the data properly. It's 900 rows. Where do we want this pivot chart to be placed? Existing worksheet, location. We're going to put its upper left corner in cell J1. Click OK. It's kind of a busy screen here. I'm going to move the Pivot Chart Fields dialog box a bit to the left here so we can focus more on what we're doing. If you've worked with pivot tables, you are perhaps familiar with terms like columns and rows, but we're seeing words like legend and axis. So at first this might be a little bit unsettling, but here's what we're about to do. We're going to put customer into the location called axis category here. And in the chart, as soon as we do this, we don't see much happening other than the wording disappear. But let's bring in some values here. In other words, we might want to show the number of items sold. Since that is a numeric field, we'll simply click it and it will appear as values and it will appear in the chart. In the background, even if we didn't ask for a pivot table, it's being created anyway. And we see it there in columns J and K. If we'd like to also include product in this mix, we'll put product into the legend series. This corresponds to the column labels area in our standard pivot table. So now we have a pivot chart as well as a pivot table. And we can manipulate data within the pivot charts field that we see to the left, and the pivot table over in columns J, K, and L, etc., will react immediately. So maybe we'll flip the relative positioning of product and customer. Right now, when we're looking at the pivot table, we're emphasizing, for example, the idea that the B&B Spaces customer is our biggest buyer by far. But let's focus more on the product. So we'll put product into the axis category, put customer into the legend series. Now we see emphasis on the different items being sold here. And like regular pivot tables, if you work with them, you know, you can have multiple fields in play here. So possibly we want to bring the region right next to the product. That makes for a pretty busy chart. Anytime you are working with pivot charts, a strong suggestion is when the chart starts to become too busy looking by your estimation, click the chart if it's not already selected, go to the Design tab in the ribbon, and then change the chart type off to the right to a stacked column or possibly a stacked bar. You can certainly change the style of the chart. It doesn't have to be a column necessarily, but if you are using column, I'd recommend stacked column. It will clean up or make the chart appear less busy as it does here. There's still a lot going on in the chart. And the more you work with pivot charts, I think you'll come to realize too that pivot tables that are not necessarily very large sometimes do display a chart that's quite crowded. And if we don't want this anymore, we'll just delete it. What if we change our minds at a later time? In any existing pivot table, and here's one here, regardless of its layout, if you want to create a pivot chart, you can simply press Alt F1. That creates a pivot chart. I tend to do that myself more often, but you can create a pivot chart from the beginning along with the pivot table, or activate it later, or as the case may be, delete it whenever necessary.